and welcome to Unapologetic Podcast by SilverJay. This podcast aims to controversially rebel and collectively fight for women, and specifically women of colour, to be heard and understood. The essence of Unapologetic is to express our individualism and value ourselves whilst advocating for a better society. In using our colonial histories, the podcast aims to unpick and understand why we are the way we are. On today's episode, we are getting real. Queerness has been an area that I've been desperate to do a podcast on, and it's totally entwined with feminism and provides such a deep understanding of ourselves, our expression, who we are. And what's even more interesting is the relationship between queerness and Hinduism that's largely been ignored in Western feminist literature. It's widely thought that queerness cannot be associated with religion due to stringent gender binaries, but today we're here to deconstruct this. I'm so excited. Okay, so I'm here with the incredible Hiren, and I want you to tell me a little bit about who you are and why you're actually sat here today.
Firstly, thank you for that incredible introduction. You said incredible, and I was like, you might have got the wrong person. But yeah, no, it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me. So yeah, why I'm here, I think it's not time to start having these serious conversations. You've been doing a lot of work about, different models within kind of feminism, and I think bringing that queer kind of narrative and that discourse into this is just so fantastic. But it is so encouraging to kind of intertwine those two. I, as a kind of a queer person, I kind of struggled a lot with kind of my faith and my kind of sexuality growing up. A lot of that had to do with kind of a religious perspective, but also the culture behind it. And I think it wasn't until I kind of started to study myself about actually, this isn't actually inherently Hindu. And this isn't actually inherently Indian, some of these kind of taboo, misconceptions that we've got. So I think we're in a really good place right now. People are definitely more in touch with their culture, they're more in touch with their heritage. And it's time to start having those conversations, really.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's really fascinating because it's your upbringing, it's your identity, it's who you are. And we actually met, Hiren and I. We met at a kata, I think it was
2019,
2019.
yeah.
We met at a really long 9-day kata and we got on super well. And that's when we started having really good discussions and stuff. And it was amazing. And because you are super religious and you're so knowledgeable, there is stuff that I just don't even know, even though I identify as Hindu. It's like the breadth and depth of what you actually know is so exciting, guys. So we're going to get super into it. I think what I'm going to start with is Hinduism in itself. We're going to decolonize what it means to be a Hindu in this day and age and really unpack the queer theory behind it, because it is seen as, we see Hinduism. I don't know how it's actually perceived by the West. Obviously, it's got the spiritual side, but for us, we know that Hinduism isn't necessarily a religion. It's a way of life. It's a philosophy of being. And queer theory really comes into that. And I'm going to use the term Indian mythology, but you're going to tell me why that's wrong in a minute.
I think, firstly, yes, I think with mythology, there's this kind of, I suppose it's associated with things that aren't necessarily true. And obviously, I appreciate that there's a belief aspect involved in these scriptures, and whether you believe these gods existed, whether you believe, they roamed the earth, that's down to devotion. But I think, for practicing Hindus myself, even if they didn't appear as literal as, for example, a young boy dancing on a snake with 1,000 heads, I think it's more about what those lessons teach us, the morals behind it. And I think, we do believe that some of those stories are real. Like I said, even though they've kind of become much more poetic in, again, 1,000-headed snake, but actually what that meant. So I suppose mythology is probably the incorrect word that I would use personally. But yeah, I think it's interesting to have those stories and for us to guide really in our Hindu life.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. And just a disclaimer, everybody, when I use terms and I'm trying, I think we have to give people grace. Like, it is so hard to be on a podcast and be politically correct and on form constantly, because I don't know the right thing sometimes. And I think when it actually comes to queer theory and genders and all these sorts of things, especially in the West, I'm not super versed. I'm trying my best. And I think it's about giving people grace, just having those chats and talking about it, because even if someone talks to me about race and gender and they're getting it a bit wrong or whatever, I can't control and police that because it's a part of learning.
100%.
But yeah, just that disclaimer. So, right, so let's get into it. I know that the Indian religion is super flexible with non-heterosexuality, and it's been openly discussed in a lot of various different texts. So I researched these texts, and it was like the Veda, the Purana, the Dharma Shastra, the Karma Shastra, and the Nyaya Shastra. And it's all about gender fluidity and all these types of things. So why don't you give me a few examples, or let's just get into some of the things that are that we would perceive to be outside our gender norms.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, interestingly, you kind of gave a disclaimer about yourself, but I'd also like to say, okay, I'm not definitely a scholar of Hinduism at all. I mean, like as I said, I was kind of struggling with my sexuality, and therefore it was my own journey that kind of led me to, I was finding, and probably you'll find yourself, is, as a younger generation, we are more inquisitive. And so I was going to the temple, I was asking elders or the priest questions, and they either didn't have the answers or they felt uncomfortable in, discussing those topics. And so that's what led me on this journey down. I thought, let's get rid of all the gossiping aunties in the temple, and let's go to actually a source. And then I started to learn Sanskrit myself, and then kind of did Sanskrit courses. The event that you're talking about, that we met at the Katha, Kathas are really incredible. Like, that's where we listen to kind of learned scholars to really delve into those scriptures. And so that's where I've kind of taken a lot of knowledge and kind of influence from. And then, yeah, with your own kind of personal experiences, you do feel a connection and you find what works right for you. So, yeah, definitely not a scholar. But yeah, I think it's nice to have these conversations. I was saying, within scriptures, then, so you mentioned certain scriptures. Our Veds are kind of like the basis of our kind of religion, and they're set into different kind of chapters. For example, you have the Karmakand, which is the episode of the chapter of rituals, and that's where the Brahmins you see kind of doing rituals and weddings and stuff. They will learn from there the Karmakand and stuff. And then you have, like you said, the Purans. So there's 18 Purans. Puran literally means an ancient tale. And so these stories or these tales are the ones about different gods and goddesses. And you have a whole range of them. So you have like the Ganesh Puran, you have the Bhagavad Puran, which is about Vishnu and Krishna. So you have all these different Purans, which are 18 different texts. And then you mentioned the Kama Sutra. So it's really important we say Sutra, not Shastra. Shastra is related to scripture, and Sutra means a book. So you can have a book on anything. And we have like these scriptures or these books, we categorize them as dharmic or adhyatmic. So you have like spiritual ones, and then you have like kind of the adhyatmic ones and the ones that are more almost like guidebooks of how to get the best from life. So you get books on yoga, again, kind of how to get the best from your body and your spiritual journey. And with the Kama Sutra, it's how to get the best really in terms of that desire. We don't shy away from desires in Hinduism. So when we get married, for example, we traditionally take 4 walks around the fire, right? And therefore, dharma, arth, kam, and moksha. So dharma is a sense of walking around, and we give a vow to one another that we will continue on this righteous path and we'll uphold that dharma, those rights. And then arth, because again, we're living in this world. So we shouldn't really be detached from it in that level, because if we're getting married, we're part of that kind of materialistic world almost. And within that, we need possessions. We need a house, right? We need money to live and sustainability. So dharma, arth, for possessions, and then kam, which means your desires. It's important that we have these desires. They're what drive us. So those desires could be as simple as my desire is to own a mansion, or even kind of sexually. What are our desires and how do we promise to fulfill one another's desires and achieve them? So that's what the third one is. And then final one is to underpin everything is moksha, is liberation. So we work with those 3 to mainly end up on our final goal of moksha, of liberation, to reach back to God, essentially. So yeah, it's really important. Kama Sutra is a book about desires, and a little bit different from our Shastras, but it still exists. And I think we've kind of shunned and shied away from it because, as we know, kind of with later on in my time, we've become, or we should become, that's what they think, much more kind of conservative. We have to be careful in our approach. We shouldn't be seen to be too, in touch with our sexuality or our desires. But that, again, it goes against, Hinduism, and it goes against inherently Indian culture.
Yeah. And all of what you've just said is like making my eyes wide because it's exactly the pinpoint of what we're supposed to be embracing and embodying. It's that individuality. It's that we are these beings, and we've had to suppress certain parts of ourselves in order to conform. And we're so much more than that. And I think if we opened ourselves out a bit more, and these conversations are brilliant because it means that we're opening up and we're normalizing like sexual desires and sexuality, and the fact that we do a whole round of it in the fire when we're getting married. Number one, it signifies that marriage is not just like a legal commitment to another partner, and it's a social thing that we have to do because it determines each other's worth. It's a genuine spiritual commitment to one another, and it's a part of our being and our like natural instincts and in life, because we've steered away really from what marriage truly means. I think especially being in the West and all these ideals that are coming out, it's going back home and it's going back to like the ground and the soil. And that is a lot of what I've been reading. Hinduism really is about. It's connecting with nature, soil, spiritual, universe. It's like beyond. So all
Is.
you've said is amazing.
I think yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head. Like for us as well, marriage isn't just kind of like a contract. It's not just a legal thing. It is a part of if you're kind of what we call a grahastha, which is a household, and if you go kind of that household route, then part of marriage is that. But of course, like within that, then there is kind of this underpinning of that is a part of our spiritual journey still. And like I said, it's really powerful that the last vow that you make towards one another. And now we've kind of romanticized it in Bollywood, like the woman walks first and she always says, oh, it's because if death comes first, I want to go. I'll be the one to go. But that's not it. It means that, when we get there, all these virtues and all these kind of actions, all these carryas that we're doing, they're to underpin that at the end of the day, that's our end goal. As Hindus, we want to attain that liberation. And I think interesting when you talked about like individualism as well, that's what Hinduism promotes. That's why, I used to do a lot of school visits, for example, at the temple, and a lot of children would ask, why is there so many gods? But the idea is there's so many different paths that we pick, and I think that celebrates individualism. I can't turn to you and say, right, only do this, only dress a certain way, only believe this, because I'm taking away everything that is inherently you. And Hinduism isn't really about that at all. I mean, if that was the case, then Krishna would have just appeared as Krishna and Krishna every time. But Krishna appeared as Krishna and did completely different to how Ram behaved. But they're still considered entities of the same Vishnu or the same divine, really. So individualism is really at its core. And I think, again, when I started to kind of look into things, I was like, well, actually, it's okay for me to be different. And actually, God wants me to be different. So, yeah, I think that definitely helped shape me growing up. Yeah.
That is amazing. And everything you just said is like, it's not making me like, I feel like electric as you're talking because it is so nice to just be free and like to talk about the realities of spirituality and what Hinduism really is, and that is just fab. So going back to how you used Hinduism to express your individuality, I think it would be really good for any audience members listening. How should they go about doing that if they're struggling with their sexual identity, for example? Or maybe not even sexual, but let's just go down that path.
I think first thing, and it's very hard to do, but I think scripture is really important. I mean, it is the manual, or they are the manual, should I say, for, our life, but our spiritual journeys. And each kind of branch of kind of Hinduism is very different. So, you'll have kind of very conservative branches and for example, like very strong in terms of vegetarian diet, doing certain pujas certain times a day, and that works for some people. But then on the other side, you have much more kind of practical, roots to Hinduism where people, have different ways of worshipping. If, for example, in the Ramcharitmanas, it talks about, for example, if you're going down the path of devotion, there's 9 different types of devotion. And that's not to say you have to encompass all 9, but choose one that fits for you. So I think it is a journey of self, discovery almost. And I think the way you do that it is a bit of a trial and tested method. I personally did it. I went through various different branches and organizations of Hinduism, and I was trying to find something that connected, and I felt a lot of it was forced. And my key thing is when it isn't forced, when it feels right, it is right. And don't let anybody dictate to you and say, oh, you have to do this. For example, someone telling you, oh, you have to recite so many maras and stuff every day, or you have to observe this fast. But if fasting doesn't do it for you, like if you're finding that you're actually getting quite hungry, that's not working for you, and don't do it. So I think my key giveaway is try things, try everything, but then don't feel disheartened if something doesn't work. It just means that another thing is more destined for you, and that's the thing that's going to work better for you.
That's really good advice. So what specifically worked for you?
Bhakti Yoga,
Okay.
because we have kind of like different schools of thought, philosophies, and some of them are very heavy on knowledge, which is called like Gyan Yoga. But with me, I kind of definitely went down the path of Bhakti Yoga. And Bhakti Yoga for me kind of comes back to this level of expression, because you can express yourself individually whatever works for you. So my favorite scripture, the Bhagavad Puran, it talks about all these different characters, and you have like a young boy called Dhruv, and then you have like the gopis, who are women who some of them are married and they're still able to attain Krishna. You have Prahlad again, a young boy. You have all these different kind of characters in the Mahabharata and in the Bhagavad, and they've all found God in their own way through different means. So I think for me, that really connected with me. It wasn't that there was one set route. It wasn't that there was one specific thing to do. And so this aspect of devotion, and take it how you want, you devote yourself how you want. So for example, we have the verse, ke, Tomeva mata cha pita tomeva. You are my father, you are my mother, you're my friend, you're my brother. I think it's really important is we choose that relationship, but then we have to maintain it, right? So if we have a relationship, let's say with a friend, that regular communication has to be there. So you choose a relationship that you want with God, but then maintain it the same way you would. So very famously, Mirabai, as a young child, was taught, she was very inquisitive, as children are. And so she asked, she saw a marriage procession, and she asked her mother at the time, what is that? And her mother said, oh, that's a marriage procession. And then she says, what happens at a marriage procession? And she said, oh, the bride gets married to the groom. And then she says, oh, yeah, questions keep going and going until ultimately she says, who's my groom? Now, as a young child, obviously the mother just said, well, their Ishtadev, their family deity was Krishna. And so she says to Mirabai, your husband is Krishna. But she kept that with her for life. And so much so that when she did get married, she couldn't accept her husband as her husband because she was married to Krishna. And that communication, that relationship stayed with her until, the final day. She was kind of shunned from her family. She was shunned from society. But that's what kept her. That's what maintained her. And that was her devotion. So find what works for you. Find a relationship that works for you, whether that is, like I said, it can be, a lover, it can be a friend, or it can be like, a subordinate that we submit to. But whatever you do choose, you stick by it. Once you find what works, yeah, keep going.
Okay, that's really good advice. That's amazing. And I think you're opening up the idea of what it means to have a relationship with the divine, whatever that looks like. And that's super important because New Age spirituality in the West is really taking themes of Hinduism and really driving them forward. And some could argue that that's a really beautiful thing that's happening and it is that type of liberation. But equally, we know in our social context, in doing that, it's disrupting like genuine cultural practices and backgrounds because it does whitewash it and it makes it its own. But anyway, that is the theme that we're going to be discussing as we go on.
I thought that was just an introduction, but it's such a heavy introduction.
It's a heavy introduction to colonization. And but actually, before we get into pre-colonial Hinduism versus now post-colonial Hinduism, I wanted to discuss what we talked about with the Hindu goddesses and their impact on us and how it is male and female and it's the third gender in between. I just want to get into all of that because it was so fascinating to me to learn that it's the openness and all of these parts work together to create a whole. It's not one way fits all with masculinity. Like even when we explore masculinity within Hinduism, it's not like constringent, like whatever that word is, whatever that it's not one way of being a masculine. It really takes various forms in itself. And same with femininity, and the way they combine with each other is amazing. And then within Hinduism, we know that we don't necessarily have multiple identities the way Western literature has framed like gender and sex and like queer literature. we have the third sex, which basically encapsulates all that we discuss. And for me personally, and no shade, it simplifies that for me, like mentally. And because there is infinite forms of gender and sexuality, listing the infinite forms is a task and a half, and it's going to be overcomplicated. Whereas the way I see it through this way makes it simple, but in its most magical way. And it sounds really airy fairy, but I don't care. And you've got, so you've got that fluidity within it. And the third sex is super important for us. Like we talked about hydras, and they're actually seen as, you know, very spiritual and more closer to the divine in some ways, because they embody so many different aspects of themselves, and they are seen as somebody and like people that we look up to in certain ways. Like there are examples of hydras being like known to bless children when they're born and things like that. So talk to me.
Yeah, I think one thing we can't shy away from when we're talking about kind of, you know, femininity, when we're talking about kind of the queer narrative and Hinduism, is that we still worship goddesses. And inherently, you know, the goddesses sit within, you know, depending on the school of thought, of course. But, you know, these practices of worshipping these goddesses has been going on so since the start of Hinduism. You know, we have various schools within kind of what we call Shakti Upasana, so people who worship Shakti. And again, Shakti within obviously kind of our languages, we still have the masculine words and the female words. And the word for power or energy is feminine, it's Shakti. And so we can't shy away from that. You know, we talk about kind of Shakti at the center of everything we do. And also, when we're talking about masculine and feminine words, we kind of have Purush, which means, you know, male, but Prakriti, which is nature. And again, nature inherently gives us the energy. It kind of sustains the world. So you have the first Shakti, the energy that created Prakriti, the nature. And then we had Purush. And then we had kind of man and female living within. So Shakti is all around us. You know, we can't dispute that. And I think there are schools of Hinduism now who maybe through a colonial mindset have kind of got now this route of, you know, there is just one male, you know, deity. But if you actually go back, like I was saying, to the roots of our Veds, you know, that's not true. And I think, you know, again, what I was saying at the start is read these scriptures for yourselves. Like now we can access them. And I do strongly encourage people whenever I kind of have this opportunity to have dialogue is don't just listen to me. I could be wrong. I could be an idiot. But read these scriptures for yourself as well. So yeah, we have all these goddesses, and also kind of those goddesses depict different females in kind of different forms of their lives. So, for example, within the school of the Mahavidyas, you have kind of 10 goddesses, and the last one of them is called Madhumavati, and she is depicted as a widow. You know, she's depicted as an old kind of frail widow in a white sari, and you can see she's definitely, you know, elderly. And yet we look at kind of India and Hinduism now, and we shun widows, and that doesn't make sense to me because on one side the schools were worshipping goddesses depicted as widows. So again, kind of schools now where they're saying, oh, you know, you shouldn't touch widows, you shouldn't speak to widows. That doesn't make sense to me. And it was something that definitely clicked with me, like I said, when I was kind of doing my research. Even talking at Navratri, you know, we kind of, a lot of us celebrate it, definitely more kind of within the Gujarati community because we have, you know, the Ras and the Garba, which I'm still to take you to, by the way.
I know, I'm so shy.
We have Navratri. You know, Navratri is such a huge festival, but let's get into the essence of that. You know, Navratri, we dance around a pot called a garba, and we sing garbas around a garba. And garba.
I'm just going to pause there. I didn't know that. I didn't. You told me, and I was like, what? Anyway, garba, love it.
We sing garbas around a garba.
Okay.
And a garba is traditionally a clay pot, and it's got holes in it. And the garba comes from a Sanskrit word, garb, and garb means a womb. So during Navratri
Just say that
time,
again.
So it comes from a Sanskrit word meaning womb.
Womb.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just if you didn't hear
Just to
that, it's
emphasize
womb.
that. If there was a Star Plus, you'd have like the slow motion effects right now.
I will.
So you have the garbo and you have, and then you put a dio, a candle, inside this clay pot. And the idea is that once the light is inside that, the light then kind of permeates through these holes of the garbo. Essentially, that symbolizes life inside of a womb. And it is the greatest power in this world because without that, none of us would be here. The world wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be alive. It's as simple as that,
Yeah.
both in a scientific perspective and also from a spiritual kind of perspective. And so we have this Garbo at the center, and then we do 9 days of Navratri for 9 different Durgas, so Nav Durgas, which then kind of transpands into we have the 9 planets that kind of sustain, the world. It's part of our entire cosmos. So 9 planets, Nav Durga, 9 days of Navratri, all centered around one central idea of this womb, which is this pot that we dance around and we honor and worship as Mataji. So in the olden days, when people didn't have access to scriptures or big screens or statues, at its center was just that pot, and that is what Navratri is about. So we look at kind of these festivals, we look at these traditions, and we're like, how can we not worship females? How can we not be a feminist kind of school? How can we not be a feminist religion or way of life, whatever you want to talk about? And I find it quite sad now that there are schools of Hinduism that they don't celebrate Navratri, and they see it as kind of, oh, it's, very westernized or very. If you think it's westernized, then go back to your roots. There's nothing stopping you from saying,
Exactly.
yeah, that's wrong, but let's go back. And I'm quite proud of the organizations that still have traditional garbas, because those traditional ones are the ones that glorify the goddesses and remind us, one, why we're there for Navratri, but two, remind us that we're here for goddesses. We're here to connect with that. And then the final thing I'll mention about goddesses is we still have this school of thought where we have Gurdevis, and these goddesses are considered to preside over, our families, our lives. Whenever we do any religious kind of duty, we should always seek the blessings of our Gurdevis. And there's mentions in scriptures where even the gods did that themselves. They went back to their Gurdevis, like Ram Bhagwan, for example, is believed traditionally to have gone back to his Gurdevi after he'd killed Ravan in the war. Similar to Krishna, he had a Gurdevi. And so our Gurudevis are still with us, and we believe that we should still honor and respect them. So whether you're a man or a woman, that Gurudevi's name should always be with you. So yeah, a lot of kind of talk about, a lot of people are now not using that, or they've kind of forgotten about it. But I think the reason why we've forgotten about it, which probably brings us back to this kind of conversation about colonialism, is when the British came to India, a lot of these practices, because they came from kind of this monotheistic religion where they just had kind of like one God. And also the masculine side of it was just Jesus Christ. And even now God is considered to be masculine. When they came to India and saw all these practices and traditions, they considered us to be barbaric and was like, yeah, that's not quite right. And we're like, I'm looking at that now being, who's the barbaric ones here?
Yeah,
We were always
exactly.
at one with nature. We always considered nature to be this feminine force and kind of power that we needed. So we were always much more in touch with all the elements and everything around us. Whether you look at that through even yoga, for example, that's us doing Surya Namaskar. We're bowing down to the sun, for example, and paying reverence. So yeah, I think, yes, things may have got lost along the way, but there is nothing stopping us from going back to the source now and going back to
Totally.
saying, this is what we're about.
Totally. Oh my God. Yeah, it's so true. Oh my God, that was ironic. But it's so true because we have the power now to go back to our genuine roots, and that's exactly what you advocate for, and that is what I'm
100%.
trying to like now start to learn and stuff, because if we discuss the impact of colonization, what is it to say that we can't now decolonize and deconstruct what it meant? And Hinduism at its very core is so strong. It's so strong that the British didn't and they weren't able to disable it from itself in India. So that the very core of it, the essence is still there. It's just like honing in on it and being consistent with it. And I think the next area that it'd be really fascinating to go into is how the British actually did go in and impose the gender binaries and the very like strict ideas. And I think it's the example of what was it, the anti-sodomy law in 1861. So obviously in pre-colonial India, we were very much like I have it here somewhere. Oh yeah. So it's like while same-sex desire was not uniformly valorized or celebrated in pre-colonial India, homosexuality wasn't like necessarily like frowned upon, or it was just like a more of a way of life. And obviously we don't have many texts to justify that or showcase that, because obviously there wasn't really this idea of keeping a track of what we were up to, historically. But then the British came in and instilled the anti-sodomy law in 1861. And that is where we start to see the shift in how we perceive male and female, and particularly in economically deprived areas. You see it more vividly in the villages and stuff. And there are the examples that come out of India where, you know, women are being killed because they're doing super well at work. And, you know, I think a father was upset by that and felt shunned by his village that his daughter was, you know, providing for the family, and he killed her. So there are these examples that come out, and I can't entirely blame the British for this as well, because it is super nuanced, and there is a lot that we need to unpack when it comes to economic deprivation and religion in India, because obviously we don't just have Hinduism. There are a multitude of religions that exist as well that we want to pay like an ode to too. But I think there was that shift, you know, obviously. And I think you gave another example. What was the other, the some law in the 1870s?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I mean, it's wrong to say or assume that that India was a utopia for kind of queer people. I'm not saying that it
Yeah.
was like, pride all over kind of India by no means, but I think that, there was a level of acceptance that I think was still there. But I think once you come and criminalize it, then I think that kind of cements, a lot of misconceptions, and that's the problem. Along with that, I mean, you talked about kind of like, the hijras and the kind of third gender. So we refer to them as Ginnar, and they were considered to be kind of divine beings because, and I'm going to go back to Hinduism a little bit again, I apologize.
No,
But
don't apologize.
we inherently, we believe ourselves to be an Atma. We're a soul, and the soul is considered to be formless and genderless. Our aim is to merge back with the Paramatma, the eternal or supreme God, if you like, supreme soul, should I say, and then that soul is God, what we refer to as God nowadays. And so inherently, that Atma, that soul, it doesn't have a gender. Now, when we're born into this life, obviously we're born into, our bodies, our kind of sex or gender is assigned at birth. But why the Ginners or the Hijras were considered to be very kind of divine and spiritual beings is because they were able to transcend from the body that they were born into. So they were able to say, yeah, okay, fine, I'm born into this male body, but actually, spiritually, I can transcend that and inherently be who I want to be. And therefore, because they were able to detach themselves, they had that level of what we call vairagya, and they were able to detach themselves from this materialistic body, essentially. They were considered to be spiritual people. And because they were that spiritual, that's why they were able and had the right, if you like, to bless people.
Wow.
And so when we look at our scriptures, they appear at auspicious occasions to bless events, to bless people. Even now, like you said, they are able to kind of bless young marriages, and when children are born in houses, they're blessed. Now, here though, I think we've gone a little bit haywire, so to speak, because now we consider them as kind of like, you see them as films as like kind of some comic value or some comedic thing. That is wrong. The reason is they were shunned into kind of, she was shunned away from society because after the law against homosexuality came in, 10 years after that, I think it was 1871, the Hijra community, the transgender community, were labeled as a criminal tribe by the British in India.
Oh my
And
goodness.
so again, fine, they may not have been a utopia where they were, accepted everywhere. But then when you term someone a criminal tribe, obviously that brings with it a lot more kind of restrictions and boundaries from society. And so therefore they retracted from society and became kind of hidden, if you like, and now, became able to step out just to kind of seek their right to bless people. But nowadays, like I said, because we still have that mindset, right? We're still not able to move past it. And so, we see them, like I said, as like some comic effect in a movie.
Yeah.
It's quite disrespectful, actually, to the history of why they were considered to be so spiritual and so powerful and had that right to appear anywhere and give their blessings.
Yeah, it makes me really upset when I see, like, it's almost like we name them as they're like in the subaltern now. So they are like sub-society based on all these laws that were implemented and created. And just by the justification of us being barbaric and uncivilized, it's heartbreaking to see that we were so and we are so connected, and the impact that Hinduism has on spirituality, and actually in essence a lot of scientific discovery that is now being discovered in the West. It's quite sad that all that information was there for us to share. And I think just bringing it back to a personal experience I had when I was younger, I was super into Sai Baba. So I was a major
I love
Sai
that.
follower. I was a follower. And I did the 9 Thursdays quite frequently. And yeah, I was super religious when I was younger. I felt very connected. I was drawn to my religion without any force. My parents aren't, that religious either. We're just quite connected spiritually. And I remember going into school and explaining to some of my peers that I was doing these side prayers, and I discussed that Sai Baba was a part of the universe, didn't have one religion. He was very much, in tune with different religions, Hindu, Muslim, and I really connected with that because I didn't like the idea of one religion being the right way. And, it was so open the way he was and is. And if anybody has the Psy picture in their room, his eyes are piercing, like, that picture where he's literally directly looking at you. It is so, you connect for some reason so heavily. So that was my way of connecting when I was younger. And I remember being in school and it was shunned and it was mocked, and it was quite heartbreaking actually how rude, people were about me just being expressive of my religion, and, a saint that I was connected to and I was so excited to share. And I know kids can be horrible. We know that. And I think that was sort of the pinnacle of where I ended up going further and further into a shell of my religion, and eventually it didn't dissipate. I'm building it back up. But yeah, it is heartbreaking, and it was a true representation of what colonization has done to Hinduism and India in itself. It's seen as so outside of the norm. It's very much othered. We've been alienated, and that alienation of the hijras in your example, yeah, it strikes a chord because that is what that small example feeds into a much larger example in how it's reproduced in today's society, and then our skin color comes into it because then we are seen just as that. And I think that now comes again, background in the cycle of what it means to be us, and that's the individuality that comes out of us and our forms and our path. And individuality is hence why I did
Unapologetic.
exactly. So it's so funny, isn't it, how it all comes back round in a cycle. But yeah, that was my personal experience with it. And yeah, it's very interesting how colonization has really impacted our perceptions of people and what they're seen as. I think a big example that the British used was the idea of widow burning. So it's Sati, isn't it?
Sati, yeah.
Yeah, Sati. So they used that example and basically used it as a justification as to why the British needed to go in and sort all these brown people out because, they were just completely,
We're
just savages.
Yeah.
That's just what we were. And sometimes perceived as still now in a lot of media. So let's unpack Sati a bit because it's controversial, and we have to also highlight that there are and were you know inhumane practices within our religion and our cultures and traditions. But yeah, let's unpack it because we don't want to shy away from some of the inconsistencies that we see as well.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really glad you mentioned it actually, because I think, we talk about colonialism, we talk about the British going to India. There were things that they did, that were correct. And for example, their role in kind of abolishing sati and kind of criminalizing that act is commendable. We know even not just now, but even at the time that was inherently wrong. So yeah, I think we have to kind of give thanks to that. But I think at the same time, what we don't want to do is make sure it give that ammunition to a savior complex to say, yeah, like you said, we've gone in and we've abolished this, and therefore, yeah, perfect. And India needs us. Indian Hinduism doesn't, and as you said, kind of Hinduism was thriving, is thriving, and will continue to thrive. I do believe that. I believe we are, like you said, getting back to our roots, and I think similar to we had kind of when the Black Lives Matter movement was going on, you find people of all races were actually using that as a time to open up that discourse about where am I from? What does that represent? And going back to those roots. Let's go back to roots of Sati then. So with Sati, there was a misconception. The story of Sati actually relates back to our Purans, those ancient tales. And again, my kind of disclaimer is read scripture, kind of go to the source yourself, but also like if you find it's a little bit difficult, find a learned person who can kind of delve into it a little bit more. But yeah, I'll try to do it as a snapshot. Sati was kind of a avatar or personification of Parvati, and as you know, Parvati and Shiv are a union. And so Shiv and Parvati, they were married and living happily together. And again, I've not got time to kind of delve into all the history, so I encourage people to do so. But the story goes that Sati's father wasn't very happy with the union. And so one day he organizes a big religious event at his house. Whilst Sati and Shankar, Shiv, are in their house, they kind of hear that, oh, this occasion is happening at Sati's father's house. And so Sati asks Shiv, oh, let's go. And Shiv basically says, according to the customs and the traditions at the time, we've not been invited. How can we turn up? And Sati says, well, it's my father's place. I don't need an invitation. It's just a given thing. But Shankar was still a bit, I'm not sure about this. But Sati obviously is quite adamant. It's my father's place. I really want to go. I want to go and see my sisters, my mom, and my friends, etc. And so Shivji says, I can't stop you. You're a woman. You can go if you feel it's right to go. You go, but I won't come. And so Sati attends. When she attends this religious event, she realizes that the entire thing was orchestrated to embarrass Shiv. So the idea was that if he would have turned up there, he would have been embarrassed because he would have said, you've turned up here without an invitation. On the contrary, if he didn't turn up, then they would have said, oh, he's not even come to his own family event. So the whole thing was orchestrated. Sati turns up at the house and then kind of realizes what's happened. And she then starts to hear all these insults against her own husband. Now, at that point, she's really hurt, she's broken, she's embarrassed as well slightly because she realizes she can't go back home because she couldn't face going back home to Shiv and saying, you were right and I'm sorry and I've had to, hear all these insults now because I went there. So she can't go there and she can't leave and she can't go anywhere else. And so her only option at that time, so the religious thing, they were doing a havan or a yagna with a fire.
Right.
And so she then decides, this is it. I will end my kind of life here. And therefore puts her right toe towards the fire. And then basically her life kind of just ends there. So that's how Sati kind of self-immolated, so to speak.
Right.
But the difference is, one, she was a goddess. And she chose to kind of just touch her right toe to the fire.
It's a choice here.
And that was a choice, and it ended. And it wasn't because she was following her husband into the afterlife or anything like that. And then actually, what's beautiful about it after is Shiv, obviously in meditation, realizes what's happened. He then becomes furious and then decides to seek revenge. He seeks revenge, and a fierce form of his called Galbhairav or Galbhadra appears and basically starts destroying the place and killing everyone. Or the gods go to Shiv and say, you need to calm down a little bit. He finally appears there and sees Sati's dead body. And so he picks it with him and he carries it with him. And he can't let go of Sati because obviously his body's there and the love is so strong and intense. And so finally, Vishnu Bhagwan appears with his disc, the Sudarshan Chakra, and Sati's body is basically cut into all these different pieces. Wherever the body fell, different Shakti Peeth is driven, and that's where the different goddesses come from.
Oh, wow.
But then finally, Shiv, in his kind of grief of it all, he drops a teardrop from heaven, and we believe it landed on earth and became known as the Rudraksh tree, which is the Rudraksh beads that we all wear now. And so that's the symbolism of the union of Shiv and Shakti, and actually the strong devotion between them as well. So it's quite a nice, beautiful story, really.
Okay.
But actually, so this whole practice of Sati being used to kind of jump on the funeral pyre, and again, it inherently is wrong because what that person has done, let's say if I was a straight man, if I was a straight man, if I was a straight man and I died, whatever karmas, according to Hinduism, whatever karmas or actions I have done, that determines what happens to me. That's nothing to do with my partner, my wife, my husband, whoever.
Mm,
Everyone comes with their own kind of destiny, kind of thing. We lead our own life. So this whole aspect that she would then go to serve him. Well, what if he's going to hell? You know,
yeah,
what's
yeah,
happening
yeah.
to him? So this whole practice is completely against Hinduism, and it's good that we've talked about it, but it actually has nothing to do with scripture. That being said, there are some beautiful cultures, and I don't believe in abolishing all cultures and traditions because, you know, for example, what's a big Hindu wedding without stealing the groom's shoes, for example,
Exactly,
and all the
yeah.
games we play? So, yeah. But again, I know I sound a broken record. If we go back to scripture, it's nice to kind of get in actually to the meaning of it.
It's really cool that you've actually explained where the origin comes from, because I think with any, so let's say you strip away the brutal colonial history and you just look at India as an entity. With any religion and any country, when they're reading scripture, unfortunately it gets translated, and if it's in the wrong hands it can go down a very strange path and it can travel in certain ways. So I think for us, and I think what a lot of British Indians potentially struggle with, is this idea, and I've actually spoken about this on a couple of posts, is this idea of we can also hold ourselves accountable to the way some practices have traveled in a negative way in our culture. So Sati is a great example of that, and how it traveled in a negative way, and then we can personally stop it dead. It's cool that the British did, but they also did 99% of really terrible things too. So that is one example, and unfortunately the British used that specific example to demonstrate what India was like as an entirety, and as we know that's completely just wrong and irrational. So we do it in that way. What we now face is the issue with how it's perceived, and then we are going back to our roots and our culture, and we're trying to undo and unfold all these different meanings. Like as you just did, you basically, in my head, deconstructed that entire like theme. Like that was something that was always used to really annoy me in my head because I couldn't justify why that was happening, and now I can, because it's reading, it's knowledge, it's power, it's amazing. So what I'm trying to say here, we're in a really tricky part because we want to defend our culture and our identity, but also hold it accountable at the same time without the West having their silly opinions on what we're doing as well, because there are so many different angles to look at this. And I did a post on how, unfortunately, some of us exotify our own culture, and we almost, I don't know if this is realistic, culturally appropriate our own culture because we exotify it too much. Like we glamorize it and romanticize it. And in reality, it's like every other society. Obviously, it has its there are things that we have to undo and maybe not do as well, as cultures and traditions, maybe not necessarily religious scripture, because it's how religion turns into tradition, which is where I think sometimes we have a lot of failure, because a lot of the things that I do in my family home, a lot of it is tradition. It's not necessarily derived from scripture. It's just the practices of a household that may be regressive if we've got a patriarchal household, which I don't, which is great. But if I did, then it's undoing that as well, and it is very complex trying to unpick it, defend it, be a part of it. But I think, yeah, how you've explained that was amazing, and I hope that makes sense because I think I rambled, but
No, of course. I think, that it's quite nice. I mean, we talking about like kind of British colonialism, but like you said, there's a level of kind of onus and responsibility on us to actually, and as you said, that we're Indian, we're kind of South Asian, but there's a whole kind of range of kind of religions, and I unfortunately can't speak on behalf of every religion. I can't even speak on behalf of Hinduism.
yeah.
But I can only speak from that angle, so to speak. So we have that responsibility, right, to go back and say, actually, this is right and this is wrong. And, the Hindu religion, we're encouraged to ask questions.
Mm,
When we look at our scriptures, they start with questions. So that means people are seeking. They're always supposed to be seeking. They're also supposed to be evolving. There's a Sanskrit word called bravahi. Bravahi means flowing, to flow. And so therefore we're considered to be constantly flowing. That's why our culture and our religion is supposed to evolve. We are meant to kind of change with society based upon desh, kal, and paristiti, which means the time, place, and the situation. So for example, right now, let's say our podcast, your podcast,
No, ours.
colonize this podcast, your podcast. Right now, your aim is to kind of get the most out of this information and kind of disseminate that information out. However, let's say the fire alarm went off. You're not going to carry on continuing this podcast, right? Your aim then is to get yourself out of the building and hopefully get me out of the building safe.
Yeah.
So, like that's what Hinduism and kind of our religion teaches us, that according to time, place, and circumstance, things can change. And we do need to evolve with times. So I think there is an onus on us to kind of evolve, and within that level of evolving, to question things, constantly question things. Like you said, if there's situations or rituals that you're unsure about, question them.
Yeah.
Like if you're getting married, ask your priest or ask your family elders, why do we do these customs? If they make sense and they align with your ideals, fine. But actually, and I've been to weddings recently where like the priest has, like made the bride and the groom kind of recite vows to each other. But they were very sexist, very regressive.
Okay,
Like,
yeah.
the bride was supposed to make a vow that she was constantly supposed to cook for her husband. And I'm like, if he can't cook, that's a red flag. You know
Yeah,
what I mean?
totally.
Like, leave the mundo. But yeah, like things like that, question those things.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to question as well. Again, I think that's my other kind of takeaway that I would always tell people, always question. And finally, I think there is an onus on men. And I know that's easy for me to say as a queer man,
Yeah.
but I think there is an onus and responsibility on men. We do kind of talk about kind of British colonialism and how kind of the British did that. But let's not also forget that a lot of male people, particularly the male Brahmins who had the power and had access to those scriptures, limited it.
Yeah.
And that's why now people know far and wide around the Bhagavad Gita, they know that exists. But how many of us are reading scriptures related to the goddesses? Like there's a beautiful part within the Chandi part, which is dedicated to the goddess, where Shiv, and again, we consider him to be Mahadev. He's the god of gods. He's the great god. But there's a question, there's kind of a dialogue moment within there where he even asks Mataji, he asks Durga, how do people worship you? What is the best way to attain you? So if Shivji is asking, how do I attain you? That should be a lesson for us, right? If this God who we're referring to as Mahadev is asking, how do I attain? Why aren't we asking those questions?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we've lost a little bit of that because, like I said, a lot of the male Brahmins did restrict that access to scriptures. They didn't talk about that. They didn't talk about, again, like some of the more kind of sexualized elements of some of our scriptures because,
Yep.
you wanted to hide that. You didn't want women to become too free. You didn't want women to become too fluid. You didn't want them to actually have their own thoughts, right? You didn't want them to practice and express themselves a certain
Yeah.
way because what happens if I actually tell, and also women, like if I tell all these women suddenly that, oh, actually, you are more powerful than me. You yield a lot more power and influence than I ever can. That's where the fragile kind of masculinity comes to play.
Yeah.
So I think we also need to be asking those questions ourselves, but to the brothers, the fathers, the husbands in your life, especially if you're listening and you've got children, make sure that your son is aware that actually, yes, we do have the Bhagavad Gita and it talks about Krishna in such a beautiful way, but also we have the Devi Bhagavad where Mataji is worshipped beyond, all else kind of thing. So yeah, there is onus and responsibility on us as well.
I'm just taking all that in. That was amazing.
In a good way.
Yeah, like again, it's great for you to be explaining this and expressing this. And yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about the Hindu goddesses. We talked about Navratri, which literally blew my mind as well. But yeah, the onus really does need to be on men in our generation. We have access, and podcasts like this, there is that information there. It's literally like allowing us. But again, men don't specifically want to access it. There has to be a want and an undoing. And we see in a lot of our culture, specifically in the West, there is a lot of toxic masculinity that is really, really coming out. And I think when we see it, it scares me a little bit. I think I get a bit worried about how far it is going and has gone. And I think bringing it back to the power of the feminine and the divine, I actually think it frightens a lot of men, because if they allow women to sit and be in the power that they have, what would actually happen. And I think we're seeing this cultural shift at the moment where women are, a lot of our independence, if we look at it from our social context, a lot of independence comes from financial independence, and a lot of women are now attaining that. And in attaining that, there becomes a level of threat and insecurity from the opposite gender and from men. And I've definitely seen that quite often. And you've got a very interesting angle, because of the angle that you're coming from. It is it's fluid and it's open, and you are able to critique in a way that isn't like, the way you can critique it is just very honest. And I think that honesty and that vulnerability of critiquing men is required from other men, regardless of their sexual identity. I don't think that should necessarily matter. I just think because you've got that side, it is easier to open and to come out. No pun intended. So, yeah, I think that's a really good way you've put it, and I think men need to learn a thing or two
I
from
think,
that.
I think there's also something that I did want to share is as a
Yeah.
queer person, any homophobia that I have experienced in this country has been from South Asian men.
Right.
I have never had a white person on the street call me anything. It's always been from other South Asian men. And so I do think that discourse does need to be happening. These temples, mosques, gurudwaras, more than just religious places, these conversations need to be happening, right? They need to be happening about how do we, create levels of equality,
Yeah.
for all genders, for all sexualities. It's not just a case of coming down, bowing, putting £10 in the donation box, and then walking. I
Yeah.
think, there is a responsibility on these religious leaders to be doing more. And especially now in the days of like kind of social media and stuff, like this podcast, fantastic. Why aren't more Mondays doing that? And I think again that brings another question of like, so what are these leaders of these institutions doing, and how can we do more? And as cliche as it sounds, we can do more, right? We can go back and, like I said, read your own scriptures, go back, question things that are happening. If there's traditions happening in your local Mondays, then question what they're about and why we're doing them. And then again, don't blindly follow. That's never been in our nature as Indians, as Hindus. We're never supposed to do that. And I think, again, I love that our scriptures start with questions. They're constantly seeking. I mean, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, we talk about it, but it's Arjuna is asking all these questions because he's asked these questions. We have this gem that is the Bhagavad Gita, this conversation. It wasn't just Krishna just didn't appear and started giving a lecture and be like, okay, listen, Arjuna's asking all these questions. That inquisitive nature inherently should be there. So I think definitely we need to do that. And like I said, we need to be honest with these critiques. We need to actually go back and be like, actually, that doesn't sit right anymore, and we should really, get rid of things. I mean, like I said, if the British are able to go into India and do it with Sati, what is stopping us from living in this country and saying, oh, actually, a vow for me as a woman to just constantly serve and look after my husband, that doesn't sit right with me, and I'm not going to do that. And we need to break that cycle ourselves.
Totally. And I think it's up to the men also to have that critical analysis too, and not take it for granted. It's like when we are discussing queer theory in the West, because of the way it's traveled in literature and the way it's seen in media, obviously it's a bit of a sensation, and there is a lot of negative connotations surrounding it at the moment, which, I don't necessarily want to go into.
That's another podcast.
That's the whole thing, and I need to read about 10 pieces of literature before I talk about it. So the way it's traveled has created this hostility, and we're becoming so much more enforced in our gender binaries. And I think for South Asian men, there is that level of toxic masculinity that keeps coming out and keeps coming back out, and this side, and the homophobic narratives that are associated with a lot of men. It really is reinforcing this idea of just putting women down and putting queer people down.
I think it's in, we talk about like all these different like masculine gods, like you said, Ram and Krishna, etc. But it's not as if like they were considered to be what we would consider now as like very macho masculine men,
Mm,
like they were all considered to be very playful, like again, kind of gender fluid, like Krishna was going playing grass and stuff with the gopis and in the forest and stuff like that. Like, even Ram Bhagwan and like was, quite soft in nature in terms of when it needed to be and was quite accepting of, like I
mm,
said, like even in the Ramayana, the Ramcharitmanas, when a tribal woman is kind of offering him berries that she's already bitten into just to make sure they're sweet enough, he's able to accept them, as kind of a sign of devotion. And as we said, Shiv cried in the absence of Sati. So this ideals of like these kind of like fragile masculinity, it doesn't come from Hinduism. Our like, even when you see these murtis or these statues of gods and with the way they dress, flowers and kind of like really intricate like clothing and stuff like that. Even that, if you
yeah,
look at it, it's very
exactly.
queer coded, right?
Exactly.
Like if I
Yeah.
walk into some of these Mondays, I'm like, pride?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so even that, where is it coming from? And again, when we question them, well, where is it coming from? And I
Yeah.
think those are conversations that need to be happening again in places of worship, but also in homes. Like if people are having like, like even setups where if you know that the son is kind of just sitting at the table expecting to be served, start questioning that. Where is that
Yeah.
coming from?
Start implementing that. I totally agree. I mean, I have a 15-year-old brother, and yeah, I am constantly having to just expect things from him that that my parents would have expected from me, and I push that even though it really irritates the household. We are pretty good at keeping it an equal household, but I do see some inconsistencies sometimes, just naturally, maybe because
Hmm.
he's younger as well, and I am much older. Um, but it is about pushing that narrative and switching it up and being that force, within your home and within your house to just push that narrative. But interestingly, like if I look at my dad, for example, he's very fluid. Like he is not shy of his masculinity is not threatened by the femininity that exists within him. And I've seen that growing up, and he's very at one with himself and who he is. And he doesn't have to put on this bravado to showcase that he is a man
Hmm.
and he is man enough. It is just exists within him. And I've seen that femininity in a man growing up, and I've very much appreciated that because I've seen that side. And I think that it might be different for my brother in many ways. But he has his own way of being, and he's learning, and he is, coming out of his own shell. And I think it's about just a lot of it is about not being judgmental. So we judge Hinduism in its way, and we can judge societies and how they live in its way. And I think it's also reading from a place of openness and not judgment. So when you're asking questions, it shouldn't necessarily be from a place of picking, it should be from a place of being inquisitive and just understanding more. And I see more and more from particularly South Asian men, it comes from a place of trying to catch you out. So if I'm discussing feminism or discussing colonization, a lot of it is to attack
Hmm.
and to be devil's advocate. And that way of thinking and being, I find number one, very low vibrational because it means you're not opening
Yeah,
your mind.
100%.
And number two, you're just trying to probe me. You're trying to create a reaction out of me that sustains this conversation. It's not productive.
Hmm.
It is literally just a monologue of you trying to at me and me just having to take it because there has to be a level of critical analysis when you're talking to people, and there is no nuance sometimes, and that the same exists in the social media spaces. If I am doing something that is talking outside of the norm, that requires nuance, that requires the gray area, which a lot of things do, we're super polarized. It has to be black and white, it has to be yes and no. And people want the simplest answer, but that sometimes isn't always the case. And I think Hinduism really values that and shows that. And I think, yeah, if people were just open to talk, it might be a bit easier than having one way of being, because it obviously, once you open up philosophy, it is an infinite amount of questions. I don't think you'll ever get the answer. It's about being at peace with what you know and learning more and not being afraid of what society is and life is. But yeah, I guess it is about the vibrations of and your energy levels and things like that. And yeah, I think women are just great. So yeah, that's my take and that's my lived experience, really.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, from a Hindu perspective, there's a very famous kind of quote which says Hari Anant, Hari Katha Anant, means the Lord is infinite and his stories are infinite. So if he's infinite or she is infinite and the stories are also infinite, we can never stop questioning. We can never stop that journey. And actually, they say that if you are stagnant, then you're doing something wrong.
Yeah.
Like you have to keep going, you have to keep evolving. And, I think that is key. Like I said, those discussions, those questions, keep asking. And I think you're in a really great space with these podcasts. And I'd like to think that people can reach out, and I encourage people to reach out if they have questions. It's really important that we do. And I think if I hadn't have had all those questions, I probably wouldn't be as in connect. I probably would have gone one of two ways, if I'm honest. I would have probably gone super religious, but then become super homophobic, or I would have just fallen completely off the bandwagon and just not had any connection with my culture, with my religion, or anything like that. So I've got to this really nice place. I'm very content. I'm very kind of, spiritually happy as well. And I'm not saying I'm the perfect, ideal person by far, but I'd like to think that I'm in a place where I can kind of encourage others to do the same. And it's such a beautiful but powerful, like empowering feeling to think I'm content with where I am. And because I'm content, I don't need to judge other people. And rather, I'm in a place where you can help uplift other people and get to the same place. And that's, for me, is equality. And you know what I mean? Like making sure, okay, so the person next to me isn't doing as well, but let me bring them up. And that doesn't have anything to do with their gender. It doesn't have anything to do with their sexuality. But where we do, like I said, suffer is sometimes we do see that and we do judge. And again, I think I'll say again, the only time I've received homophobic abuse in this country is from other South Asian men.
Yeah.
And I think that is so telling,
Yeah.
and going right back to where we started is, I'm not saying again there was a utopia of like kind of queer pride in India, but when that was criminalized by the British, and now we're in Britain, and now I'm getting homophobic abuse from South Asians, I think that's a bit,
Yeah, you can't make it up, really. It is just it is what I can't even. You just hit the nail on the head, really, with that. And I think holding yourself accountable and being self-aware. And now we've actually, not only have we just discussed Hinduism in a sense of like it being so much more than these stringent gender binaries, and we've really opened up what it means to be a Hindu, and for you being able to relate your queerness to Hinduism and actually genuinely unpacking that is pretty phenomenal. And I do think, I wish it definitely deserves more airtime. But we are at time, and I think what we've just unpacked and what we've done is really the beginning of something amazing. Like I really feel it when we were talking. I was like, this knowledge is needed. It's like we're desperate for it. And no matter what your beliefs and your religion, you can always take learnings from people who have lived before us, no matter where they come from and who they are. And yeah, and expressing that individualism is amazing. So thank you. You're amazing, and I definitely want you back. So.
My boyfriend is going to tell you off because you said I'm amazing and I'm incredible, and he's going to be like, his head didn't fit through the door when he walked in.
Sorry.
No, but likewise, I think the reason I've come is I can see this incredible work that you're doing, and social media can be a powerful tool, and I think you're using it in the exact right way. So it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I think when you asked me, I was a bit skeptical because I didn't know if I was the right person. And I think just having this conversation. So even if you think, to people who are listening, if you think you're not the right person to have these conversations, you completely are.
Yeah.
It's your lived experiences, your personal beliefs that you can share with other people and have those conversations and keep those conversations going. And yeah, I think it's been a really nice afternoon as well.
Oh, amazing. I'm so happy. Well, thank you so much for listening. And please don't forget to listen to the other podcasts and read and listen. I'm talking about my socials. Just go access my socials. It's all on there. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for
Thank you
coming.
again.